I will remind you just one time, the standards are there to improve animal health and welfare and veterinary public health worldwide. Standards are adopted by this Assembly, meeting once a year. They are references for the World Trade Organization with respect to animal diseases and zoonoses. But what does it mean when we do not implement the standards? It's a missed opportunity. Failure to work with the standards, to use the standards of the OIE, is a missed opportunity for safe trade and can also lead to disputes. Disputes cost money, and oftentimes the result isn't really a positive or helpful result for any of the parties. So, the questionnaire, just to briefly remind you, was in 4 sections. We always have a section that deals with general information. Then we looked at the use of the standards in the context of importation, importing countries. We looked at the standards in terms of exports, from the exporting country perspective. And in the part 4, we look at the challenges and what can be done, what tools can be provided to improve. We had a very good response rate. Of 181 member countries, we had 145 detailed responses. A tremendous amount of data were presented, and it's obviously beyond me to give you a detailed understanding of this, but I will try to hit on the high points. The response rate was particularly good from Asia, Far East and Oceania. All but one country responded. We had, in the countries responding, which I will say respondents, we had about half classified as developing countries, about a quarter least developed, a little more than a quarter developed countries. So that's the breakdown, that's the statistical view of the information we received. Now, of course, standards of the OIE are used in many forms. We have national standards that are directed to the prevention and control of animal diseases, promotion of veterinary public health, animal welfare. The context, the key context for this questionnaire was the WTO agreements, and specifically the agreement on the application of sanitary and phytosanitary measures. We have 89% of the respondents are WTO members, which therefore have an obligation to respect the rules, the framework, the legal framework of the WTO. And the agreement calls for participation in the development and use of international standards, and beyond that names the OIE as the standard-setting organisation of reference for animal health and zoonotic diseases. There are 5 key principles that are particularly relevant to OIE, and I will talk about each one: harmonization, equivalence, risk assessment, regionalization, and transparency. Now, a country using stricter measures, more restrictive measures than the international standards, should support this position with evidence and a risk assessment. Yet, we found that more than half of the respondents said that they do not systematically provide information or explanation to trading partners when they impose measures that are stricter than the OIE standards. I recall for you the aim of the exercise is to understand implementation of OIE standards. So this 55%, or around half, that does not systematically explain the use of stricter standards by some measures is not respecting the standards, is not respecting this requirement to harmonise measures with those of the international standards. Higher standards can be imposed, but there should be an explanation. Now, on a positive front, we're talking of harmonisation now. This is the alignment of health measures with the OIE recommendations. Nearly all respondents said that they do consider international standards. In many cases, this is a question of policy and not law. And in about half the cases, there are policies providing for systematic review and updating of the sanitary measures, which is an important point. Here, each year, the OIE updates provisions in the codes, manuals, and disease status. So if countries are not systematically reviewing the sanitary measures and the consistency with OIE standards, there's an issue, there's a potential problem. Now, harmonization, I think, is fairly easy to understand. Equivalence is a second principle, a key principle of the SPS agreement, with provisions set out in Article 4 of that agreement. My experience is that countries are not so comfortable with equivalence. Basically, equivalence exists when the health measures of an exporting country meet and can be shown to meet the acceptable level of protection of an importing country. And that's a term that is acceptable level of protection, of course, is defined in the agreement. It's good news in the sense that most countries said they have the authority to use equivalence, either as a legal requirement, around half, or as a question of policy. About half of the respondents said that formal policies or procedures are used, and about half said that their processes for determining equivalence conform with OIE recommendations. What are the challenges? The challenges in using equivalence: a lack of transparency of exporting countries, inadequate capacity of human resources, and quite a high number, 30%, who point to lack of guidance from the OIE. Now, one of the problems we have with equivalence is it is a rather complex concept. For many years, countries based their import measures on, or their import protocols, as we used to say, on a set of measures. So typically for live animals or genetic material, selection from a population, testing, treatment, isolation. And many countries, 3/4 of the respondents said that this approach to equivalence is used. However, a more contemporary approach to equivalence is to consider whether the systems, the health systems in the exporting country can provide outcomes equivalent to the requirements of an importing country. So here you see we have a lower number of positive responses, but still 50 or 60% that speak of the equivalence decision based on the systems, the animal health systems or production systems in exporting countries. Now, risk assessment, another key concept in the SPS agreement, and one that is much better understood and much more used. Risk assessment is generally the basis for health measures, sanitary measures. A high percentage said that standardised procedures are used. So this is a concept with which the veterinary services and the aquatic animal health services, they're much more familiar with this one. Risk assessment requires a good source of data, complete data and up-to-date contemporary data. So we asked the question, what sources of information do the countries use when they carry out risk assessment? And we found a very unanimous level of support for the World Animal Health Information System, for the OIE official disease status, and, of course, for the code and the manual for terrestrial animals and aquatic animals. So these were the #1 sources. These were the key sources of information, according to the responses to the questionnaire. We also had a lower number, but still a significant number of responses who say they look at self-declared disease status. And you heard the Director General say how this has been strengthened and made much more timely, the publication of self-declared disease status. The OIE handbook on risk analysis, is also commonly used. And then, of course, we have the other steps that are taken to verify the current situation: visits, questionnaires. A relatively small percentage refer to the PVS report or to the risk analysis of another country. Now, this recognition of disease status, this is an absolutely crucial thing. Exporting countries generally said this is important or very important to obtaining export market access. But they pointed out, in at least half the cases, importing countries regularly do a check. It may be a dossier is requested, a questionnaire is provided, or an on-site visit. That is not a problem for the SPS agreement, providing that it is done in a timely manner. And this, of course, is the crucial point. There have been disputes about lack of timeliness, 10, 15 years to go through this checking process, and that is not very consistent. From an importing country perspective, it's good news in that a very high percentage of the countries say they do consider official disease freedom decisions of the OIE. At least for some diseases, not necessarily across the board. Okay, but 143 out of 145 responses indicated that yes, official decisions are taken into account. Now we look at the challenges that were reported. What is stopping countries? What's impeding them from using risk assessment? And again, remember, we're now talking about the context of international trade. A very high, and I should mention, the countries could nominate more than one choice here. So you'll see there are far more than 145, because countries could nominate, I think, 3 or possibly 5 choices here. A very large focus on the sufficiency of human resources. Are the staff competent? Are there sufficient staff? Are the financial supports there? There was also some concern about difficulty in understanding the principles of risk assessment. In this case, we look also at the priorities for training, because in addition to identifying challenges, the countries were asked to identify their priorities for training. And a full 3/4 identified risk assessment as a high priority topic, and an even larger number high or medium priority for training. While we're on risk assessment, I will mention 2 OIE concepts familiar to you all, and that is safe trade and safe commodities. These are somewhat linked to risk assessment in that they're a kind of negligible risk approach. It's the identification of an approach that presents negligible risk. And these are taken into account. We have 55, 60, 63% who fully consider these recommendations. Nonetheless, training on safe trade, the concept of safe trade, is a high or a medium priority for all countries, and particularly rated high for the regions of Europe and Middle East. Now, I want to talk a little bit about zoning and compartmentalisation, and you might say, well, they weren't mentioned as SPS principles. They fall under the Principle of Regionalization, which is in Article 6 of the SPS agreement. The OIE uses these concepts, which are based on the notion of a population of higher health status than the country as a whole. This is the OIE's way of giving effect to the SPS principle of regionalisation. Now, here, looking at the challenges, you can see that basically lack of technical capacity was the most commonly reported challenge. That is to maintain a disease-free zone or compartment. Unfortunately, the question put both of those two together. Disease-free zones are quite widely used. They're mainly used with terrestrial animals, and I think there are examples in every region. Compartmentalisation is a newer concept. It seems to be more gaining application for aquatic animals, and I would say countries are less familiar with its use. And what you see in this slide is that the aspect of the private sector, the public-private partnership, the investment by the private sector, the understandings of the private sector, these are an important limitation to the use of zoning and compartmentalisation as things stand. You'll also see, second from the bottom, lack of OIE guidance. You recall that some 30% of respondents pointed to this as a problem when we spoke about equivalence. But in this case, the lack of OIE guidance is maybe half of that level of importance, which suggests that equivalence is something that the OIE needs to go into more. Now, the good thing, again, we're looking at importing country responses here, and we can see in a great majority of cases importing countries are prepared to base their decisions on importation on the use of zoning and compartmentalisation. We had a small number that said no. The green part at the top of the column is no, and that was a relatively small number. 10% maybe of the responses from the Americas, from Asia, Far East, Oceania, and a very small percentage from Africa. So we can see that the concept of zoning and compartmentalisation, these two concepts, regionalisation, if you want to call it by that name, these are well accepted. Now we go to the fifth principle in the SPS agreement, and that is transparency. We can confidently say that member countries are very aware of the OIE's role and importance in the WTO context. There's a very high rate of notification to the notification to the WTO of measures, and whether they're consistent or not consistent, perhaps that's not clearly stated, but at least notification occurs. Having said that, we had some 20%, not sure about that, we had some nearly 20% who said don't know, which suggests that there is a disjunction, there is perhaps a break in the communication point between those who establish measures, who elaborate and establish the measures, and those parts of government responsible for notification. So that's an interesting point to take up. Now, I also want to point out that training on OIE standards and the SPS agreement was one of the top priorities, top 4 priorities in all regions. It was the top priority of developed countries and the second highest priority of the developing or least developed countries. So that shows you that this is an important topic and of course explains some of the other answers, some of the other responses that we were provided with. Continuing with transparency, the first element of transparency was the communication to trading partners via the WTO, but we're also interested in communication with stakeholders. And by stakeholders here I mean the private sector, producers, processors, consumers, exporters. Are stakeholders consulted when establishing sanitary measures? So this is an important aspect of transparency. And we find that, particularly in developed countries, there is an approach to systematic consultation, but only about 58 countries in total said this is done systematically, leaving 87 respondents saying sometimes, rarely, or never. So there is an area where there's scope for improvement. In terms of the transparency of measures, once they're put into effect, again, we can see that systematically this information is made available to the public by about 59 of the respondents, leaving quite a large number who do not do this systematically, and particularly in the least developed countries. And without any doubt, there is an issue of infrastructure. When you have good high-speed internet to everyone in the country, it's a lot easier to share information. When that internet coverage is lacking, it's much more difficult. Now, this is an interesting slide because here we look at the perspectives well, is this a, let me see. Aha, right. What I wanted to point out here, this one is, where is, okay, this is importing country perspective, exporting country perspective on the other side. We have a percentage of countries complaining, exporting countries complain that importing countries do not use OIE standards. And here we have importing countries complaining that exporting countries do not use OIE standards. There is scope for collaboration. There is scope for a very productive, mutually satisfactory collaboration. Similarly, 3/4 of the importing country answers on this one said exporting countries are not sufficiently transparent, do not provide sufficient information. And here we had the exporting countries saying that the importing countries regularly check, they request dossiers, they carry out visits and check self-declared status. So you can see the scope for working together, the scope for better communication. As the Director General said this morning, information that isn't shared is wasted information. And I mean, this is absolutely, it's illustrating the point that she made. Now, I turn briefly to the private sector. You will recall that I said only about 58 of the responses out of 145 said that they could systematically share information with the private sector. Now, here we see that lack of capacity of the private sector, I cannot see the thing, there it is, lack of capacity of the private sector to comply with importing country requirements. But if the private sector is not consulted, there's a very big risk that the private sector won't be on board and maybe cannot or will not, or it's not cost effective to comply with these requirements. This really illustrates the importance of consultation with exporters, importers, producers and so forth. And again, of course, on the zoning and compartmentalisation, we saw a fairly high level of concern about the private sector lacking interest or lacking the capacity to invest. Now, so we'll turn to some of the solutions. Many of the points that I would make in this section were touched upon by the Director General in her presentation this morning. She spoke about work that's done, work that's in progress, and work for the future, and many of the points are covered here. Expanding communications, not only with delegates and import-export staff, but importantly, targeted communication with the decision makers. I think all of us in the room deal with political elected persons. Elected persons see a thing called political risk. I'm sure this is no news to you. Political risk is not always satisfied by OIE standards. Our job is to talk about animal health risk, disease risk, public health risk, but we have to recognise that the decision makers often are not seeing those risks, they're seeing other risks, and this is particularly challenging. And for that I say the OIE, it's a very welcome decision to engage more, to establish the profile of the organisation with those decision makers. If the political boss accepts zero risk and nothing else, it's very hard for the delegate to argue for the use of OIE standards. Now, alongside of that, making the standard setting process as open as possible, maintaining scientific excellence, because that is the sine qua non, but making the standard setting process open and inclusive. There may be a need to develop some new advice on equivalence. You recall we had 30% of responses who said that equivalence, they're lacking guidance from the OIE. And we also had a percentage on safe commodities and safe trade who made a similar call for assistance. Certainly the safe commodities work has been more pursued by the Aquatic Commission to date, and there's scope for a little bit more work by the Terrestrial Commission. The use of modern techniques and tools for information sharing. I personally cannot stand tweets. I just find tweets really irritate me. But younger generation and many politicians and other people consider it a useful, valuable, real-time form of communication. The OIE must go along with that. Use modern techniques, promote transparency. The Director General mentioned review and update of procedures for self-declaration and I think also for official health status. Certainly these are crucial because one of the most valuable services that the OIE provides is world animal health information and official health status. And then I'll just mention this one, the promotion of public-private partnerships, which is really a means to give effect to good regulatory practices. I haven't said much about good regulatory practices. It's going to be covered in some other sessions, but it is absolutely key. Review of standards, or measures rather, review of measures, consultation, transparency, sharing information. These are all part of good regulatory practice. Now, the OIE must take into account what the member countries find useful. There's very strong support for the activities that are currently delivered by the OIE, whether these be OIE uniquely or OIE in collaboration with WTO, STDF, other international organisations. So there's very strong support for that. There is some call to make more available, to make these sessions more available, for example, through distance learning. And that's an approach that's used by the WTO. There is an SPS training system online. Perhaps this is something that OIE could also look at. In the answers, we get a very strong feeling that the networking opportunity, that the OIE workshops provide a tremendous networking opportunity. It's not only about the technical advice, the understanding of the standards, it's also about meeting colleagues in the regions or in other regions and building those networks. Now, this one is rather busy. What I wanted mainly to say to you, these are the priorities for training. I identified and analysed according to the 5 regions. There's very good concordance. There's agreement on import risk analysis, OIE standards and the SPS agreement, disease surveillance and biosecurity in terrestrial animals. These 3 are in the top 5 for all of the regions. Now, recommendations on safe trade obviously is highlighted by some. Veterinary legislation, particularly important for the Americas and for the Middle East, particularly top importance for the Middle East, and quite important for other regions as well. And in the Far East and Oceania, you can see that communication is the second rated. So that shows that each region has its priorities. Each region collectively see the need for certain things more important than others. But at the very least, we can say that import risk analysis, standards of the OIE and the SPS agreement, disease surveillance and biosecurity, these are really in the top 5 or so topics identified by each region. So there's a challenge for the OIE because on the one hand, you could say one size fits all. There's general support for the mode of delivery. There's general support for certain topics, but also there are priorities for each region, and those somehow need to be addressed. Now, these are points for the OIE to consider. Now we turn to the points for member countries to consider, and we asked questions about, does the OIE address the priorities of member countries, and are the standards of the OIE fit for use? So the graphic shows that there's generally quite good support in terms of the priorities. There is some dissent. There's, particularly in Asia Far East and Oceania, there's a level of dissent. Also in the Americas, but no dissent in Africa. This, again, this points to the difficulty of what is implementation, because some of the countries have responded, yes, the OIE fully addresses our priorities, and some have said in part, and some have said no. So it is quite, it requires quite a detailed analysis to understand why the responses are this way. What's the meaning of it? How can we address that? Because if the OIE is not addressing the priorities of members, that's a huge problem. The OIE is the membership. It's this assembly. There's no OIE that's sort of saying, no, no, we want to go a different way. It's this assembly. And so that's something that really needs to be teased out and properly understood. These recommendations are probably not new to you, because you see this type of recommendation in various other OIE activities. So I will try and highlight the ones that really came out most strongly through the questionnaire. The participation in OIE activities is crucial. It's not only technical understanding, it's also networking. And you remember the slide where I said about 20% said you should use the standards and 20% said, well, you should use, you know, this is the sort of thing. It's not only technical knowledge, it's people getting together and talking and understanding why this or that measure could be used or isn't appropriate. The second one, the good regulatory practices, is also very important, because this is where we bring in the public-private partnership, the consultation, transparency, review and evaluation of measures. Absolutely critical. And the third one, the OIE PVS pathway, which, as we heard this morning, there are many more ideas, fruitful ideas, being brought to bear on what is already a highly successful 10 years of experience in the use of the PVS pathway. So, to the future, there will be some other presentations on this new proposal to develop an observatory. A new proposal to develop an observatory that collects information on the implementation of the OIE standards. Now, the observatory has a very good starting point, because 145 countries have already provided detailed information. I think there were 65 questions on the questionnaire. I'm sure you were all furious when you saw it, or the person who had to fill out the questionnaire wasn't happy, let's say. But the data collected is comprehensive, they're comprehensive and up to date, and this will be a very good starting point for monitoring of these matters. Personally, I see the great challenge in determining what is implementation. When is it good and when is it room for improvement? Because if a country says yes, sometimes, maybe that's quite good. Or if they say yes for certain diseases, well, it's a good start. You know, to determine what we mean by implementation, that's one big challenge. An important result from this observatory will be to provide feedback to the standard setting process. Is it sufficiently inclusive? Is it taking account of the concerns? I looked at where countries had said other, and there was a free text box to provide other information. And I noted that issues such as transhumance came out as an area that the OIE isn't really coming to terms with yet, from the perspective of those countries in which transhumance is an important agriculture system. So looking very closely at the specific points raised, really this is very helpful. And of course the development of a strategy in future to support countries in applying the standards in a more regular, consistent manner. I don't think we're talking so much about no standards versus full standards. I think we're talking about great progress having been made, and now more attention being paid to how to improve that. So it's an incremental process. So I come to my conclusions, and I thank you for your patience. Certainly the relevance of the OIE standards is very well recognised. We had an 80% response rate and countries had put a lot of effort. In most cases, all the questions were answered. There's been a lot of progress. Many of these key SPS concepts are basically embedded in national policies and national legal frameworks. But there's still work to be done, and particularly in regards to the veterinary legislation. Where there are old laws that predate the WTO, there are probably impediments to the application of the OIE standards in harmonising the standards. Another thing that we must always recognise is that diseases are ever more rapidly spreading, they are emerging and re-emerging. There are many new challenges in terms of animal health and zoonotic disease, and governments must continue to be vigilant and apply very prudent and sound approaches to risk management. So this discussion about standards, it's not to say that people must throw out what they're doing and start anew. Okay? We must be prudent, we must be very careful, we must use risk assessment. And of course, there's a constant need for investment in the veterinary services and in the aquatic animal health services, particularly in the latter, because it does tend to be a bit of a neglected area. The OIE obviously is the world leading advocate for veterinary services and aquatic animal health services, and will continue to do that. The standards and the recommendations are based on evidence and science. There's an increasing focus on research and the ascertaining of evidence that's needed. So these are comments about the OIE. Equally, they're comments about member countries, because the OIE is the membership, and the engagement of members with the OIE is what makes the OIE great. If we don't have that engagement, if we don't constantly promote that engagement and facilitate and support it, then the OIE cannot continue to do the work it does. I will put in a word for the regional offices, because I'm strongly believing in regional networks. This capacity to identify mutual issues, mutual concerns, mutual interests. Oftentimes trade, international trade, it starts within the region, right? And that's the basis, and then people go, I can do this, now we'll look at Europe, we'll look at this, we'll look at that, but it starts at the region. I want to say that all of you should consider participation in the PVS pathway. I'm currently working in Australia, and within the last month we had an evaluation of the states. We have a federal system, we had a PVS evaluation of each state in turn, and it was really well received. The colleagues there just thought it was fabulous, they thought it was a great opportunity. Now, Australia is a developed country. If Australia can see some value in applying PVS, then I'm sure many other developed countries can too. And finally, the observatory. It's a welcome initiative. I strongly encourage you to support it. I'm not necessarily here to sell the observatory, but from my reading of the questionnaire, I can see the observatory is going to be a very useful mechanism to take some of these issues that were presented to us by 80% of the countries, and to work on those things and try to improve the situation. Nothing more to do but thank the Director General, the OIE Standards Department, Diane and Karen, who helped me with the manipulation and the Excel. I'm not very good at Excel, so I was very grateful for their help. And of course to you all for your absolutely generous participation in the questionnaire. Thank you.